Good morning, everyone. We're going to give everybody another minute or two just to get into the webinar, and then we'll proceed. All right, let's uh, let's begin. My name is Scott Teed. I'm a senior scientist and ecotoxicologist here at Stone Environmental. I'm the chair for the webinar, and my co-chair is Sebastian Castro, who's an Uber environmental modeler here at Stone. He'll be controlling the team's functions and things in the background. So I'm going to give you just a really brief introduction to Stone Environmental. We are an employee-owned environmental consulting firm headquartered in Vermont, but with offices in Canada, Austria, and Germany. Our vision is to lead the development of innovative solutions that promote environmental sustainability. And our mission is to provide scientific tools, information, and analyses to help our clients solve environmental challenges with integrity, expertise, and innovation. We are dedicated to a collegial work environment that fosters excellence, creativity, and accountability through employee ownership. So this webinar is part of our 2024 ESM webinar series organized by Stone. This is the final event for this year, but we have more events planned for next year with topics to be determined. So after the webinar, you will receive a very short follow-up survey, and one of the questions will be regarding which topics you would like to hear about in the next year's series of webinars. So if you can complete that, we'd very much appreciate that. So in terms of how the webinar is going to work, we've turned off mics and participant video during the webinar. If you have any questions, please use the Teams Q&A feature at the top of your screen to type in any questions you might have during the presentation. The questions and answers will be at the end, and we will restore your ability to ask questions directly. If you'd like more information on today's topic or have any questions about our expertise in other areas, we would love to hear from you. So please feel free to contact us through the website or LinkedIn pages or directly using the provided email address. And this webinar is being recorded. So I'm excited to introduce our topic for today. It's the title of the talk is Mapping Historical Soil Organic Carbon in the US with Machine Learning. Our presenter is Dr. Hannah Rubin. She's an environmental modeler and Earth system scientist and has been with Stone very recently in 2024. So we're excited to have her. She's located in Vermont. She has a background in GIS and remote sensing and specializes in working with global climate models and future projections of air pollution and biochemical cycling. So with that, Dr. Rubin, please take it away.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for that introduction. As Scott said, today I'm going to present some of my recent work mapping soil organic carbon in the US using machine learning algorithms. So first of all, we'll start with a brief introduction just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of the carbon cycle. Then we'll talk through some of the methods and the data sources. Then, of course, results and discussion. And we'll wrap it up with a brief plan for future work and some time for questions. Okay, let's get started. So first of all, before we talk about soil carbon, what is this project about? This research was part of my dissertation, and it was funded by the FAA's Aviation Sustainability Center. Basically, the entire project is structured around figuring out ways to produce sustainable aviation fuel at a commercially viable scale. And that includes a regional supply chain analysis and some soil health research. But in order to model future supply chain logistics and evaluate the impact of biofuel production on soil organic carbon, it's important to have a baseline map of soil organic carbon in the US before we make any changes. So as part of the FAA's efforts to decarbonize, they're funding research on soil carbon and the potential impacts of growing biofuel crops. So that's where my project comes in, with mapping historical SOC, soil organic carbon, by combining in situ observations with satellite-derived variables using machine learning. So, just to reiterate, why does the FAA care about soil? Jet fuel can be made from biomass. We have the technology. It is feasible. It requires a huge scaling up effort to change supply chains, increase the number of production pathways, and decrease the costs. And the FAA wants to do this and try to lower emissions because of this Sustainable Aviation Fuel Grand Challenge. However, biofuel agriculture is not going to appear out of thin air. It requires cropland that is either already being used to grow crops or is serving some other function. And if we start converting, for example, forests to cropland by cutting down trees, then we've entirely defeated the point of growing the biofuel, because the land use change emissions are going to be much greater than the emission savings from the biofuel crop. So in order to figure out where we can convert land to biofuel agriculture, we need to have a really solid understanding of the current baseline carbon in the soil before we start to change anything, so that we have some way of measuring the impact of decarbonization and making sure that we really are not adding to the problem of climate change. Okay, so we know that the FAA is pushing for decarbonization, but soil and soil carbon are also important for a whole variety of other industries and activities, mostly related to climate science and agriculture. For example, aviation is certainly not the only industry trying to decarbonize with biofuels. Other transportation sectors are working on scaling up biofuel utilization, and so are other industries that are particularly hard to electrify. And in terms of agriculture, having an accurate idea of soil carbon at the farm scale can help farmers figure out soil characteristics that impact crop needs and fertilizer inputs. It's also important to protect and conserve areas like wetlands that are really high in soil organic carbon, but we can't do that if we don't know where they are. And then from a modeling perspective, which is my background, SOC in soil is linked to the function of the larger watershed as well as to the overall climate. So in our large Earth system models, which are also known as global climate models, soil carbon sequestration is really important, but really uncertain in terms of figuring out how the whole Earth system will respond to climate change. Okay, on to soil. So this diagram is hopefully somewhat familiar to people. The carbon cycle is this large-scale closed-loop process by which carbon atoms move between the Earth and the atmosphere. Soils are a vital part of this Earth system because they're both a source and a sink for carbon. They have the potential to either sequester carbon and slow climate change, or lose carbon and make it worse. Carbon is captured in soil through a variety of processes like litter fall and root death, and carbon is emitted due to disturbances like clearing vegetation or erosion. Soil carbon really impacts soil health, and it's often just used as a proxy for soil health. It's influenced by vegetation and climate, but also human factors like agriculture. So anthropogenic climate change has dramatically increased carbon in the atmosphere, but the soil carbon pool is actually still 3 times greater than the atmosphere, so there's a lot of scientific interest. Soil carbon is relatively easy to modify with land management, so the hope is that we can make some changes to sequester carbon, especially related to growing biofuels. And again, that is because as land is converted from a natural or an agricultural state into biofuel agriculture, SOC is either lost or gained. And that has important implications for the industries that are trying to decarbonize by switching from conventional fuels to biofuels. So getting started with the mapping. There are already maps and data out there, but they also have a variety of issues that limit their usefulness in the context of this project. So some of those problems include coarse resolution, no measure of uncertainty, a lack of data for current years, and large differences between the predicted and observed soil organic carbon. Some of these differences might be due to regional issues. In some places, the weather is pretty constant year-round, and in some places like Vermont, it's not. Or in some places, topography might be really constant and flat, and in some places it's not. There are also different ways of measuring SOC and quite a bit of inconsistency in sampling density from year to year. So my work is trying to fill this gap and create spatially and temporally continuous maps of SOC in the US using in situ measurements, long-term climate data, land use change, topography, satellite-derived NDVI and soil moisture, which we'll talk about more in a minute, and then machine learning for interpolation. So let's talk about the methods. Through a pretty extensive literature review, I found 6 usable databases of SOC in the US and started filtering for completeness and going back to the original studies to find missing metadata. Some measurements didn't have dates for their soil profiles, but they did list the original paper as a reference, so I had to go back and figure out the dates from the paper. That was very time-consuming. Some measurements were taken with different methods for measuring SOC or calculating it from bulk density, and there was a huge range in the depths of these soil profiles. Some measurements were recorded using different coordinate reference systems. So one example of this is actually visible in the figure here. You can see that there's some points sort of floating in the ocean off of the East Coast. That is clearly wrong. There should not be soil there. And it's caused by those points using a different coordinate system. So there were lots of little problems like that that I had to correct. And that's why I kept this old version of the figure so you can see it for yourselves what we were dealing with. So anyway, we ended up with 29,000 complete soil profiles, which is a pretty good start for our georeference dataset from 1984 to 2022. And that starting year will matter again in just a minute when we talk about satellite data, since Landsat 5 was launched in 1984. So in addition to ground-based observations, we also have NDVI from Landsat 5, 7, 8, and 9 pixels that are matched up with the soil profiles based on location and date. NDVI is this measure of greenness. So it can tell us how much vegetation there is in an area that can eventually turn into SOC in the long run. That's why we also included the previous 5 years of data, so we aren't just basing our results on current conditions. And then we have remotely sensed soil moisture from the ESA Climate Change Initiative, which is this collection of global gridded estimates based on 14 different satellites. Okay, we also have climate data, which is maximum temperature, minimum temperature, and precipitation from DayMet for each soil profile. And then we have a couple of other variables from the USGS: land cover, bedrock geology, elevation, aspect, and slope. So now to combine all of these observations together in a meaningful way, we need machine learning. And when I say machine learning or artificial intelligence, maybe the first thought that you have is ChatGPT and other programs like that. Those are called large language models, but that is not what I'm talking about here. Machine learning is a type of artificial intelligence, but the two terms are really not interchangeable. My definition of machine learning here is a program based on statistical methods and pattern recognition that improves performance with experience. So fundamentally, we're talking about writing a computer program that can take in training data, find some sort of pattern in the data that may or may not exist in the real world, and then spit out a result. Ideally, the more training data we give it, the better the model should get at mimicking the results we see in the real world. But that is not always what happens, and sometimes we get errors. One way machine learning models can be wrong is that they can be biased when we compare to our real world information, called our validation data set. So bias is the difference between actual and predicted values. And if it's really high, it might mean that the model is too basic and isn't replicating patterns in the training data. That would be called underfitting. Or the model might have a really high variance, meaning that the model is not sensitive to fluctuations in the data and is instead considering too much information. That can lead to overfitting, where the model will perform extremely well on the training data and maybe fit every point. But as soon as we try to predict new information, the model is too specific and it will fail. So that's why it's really important that we have both training data sets and validation data sets so we can understand what our model is doing well and what it needs to improve. And then maybe we can change some of the parameters to help it better recreate real-world patterns. So we're going to talk through some of these machine learning models. These methods have all been used in previous soil mapping studies, and there isn't really a best method, so I decided to try them all. I'm not going to go into too many details here, but I did all of the analysis in R with packages specifically written for these methods. So just briefly, k-nearest neighbors, KNN, tries to classify a new data point based on proximity by voting. It's pretty straightforward, but it can end up being pretty computationally expensive. SVM is sort of similar, but it creates a hyperplane to divide classes. One downside is that efficiency decreases as the training size increases. A random forest is a collection of decision trees that are trained independently on different randomly selected subsets of the data. So the result is this majority classification or average value of all of the decision trees with the goal of reducing variance. Regression kriging is an interpolation technique that relies on the principle of spatial autocorrelation, where values that are closer together in space are more likely to be similar to each other than to values that are further apart. Regression kriging also includes a multiple regression model with the non-spatial predictor variables to try to remove non-significant predictors. And then an artificial neural network, it's separated into nodes with hidden layers that produce a result. So these hidden layers extract patterns from the inputs and can recognize nonlinear relationships and convert inputs into this generalized output. And then gradient boosting uses decision trees like the random forest, but it's trying to reduce the bias of predictions. So the model is trained sequentially, where each tree corrects the errors of the previous tree. So now we can take a look at some of the results from the machine learning. So here we have all of those machine learning models that I just showed, plus a linear regression at the top for comparison. And across the top, we have the mean absolute error, root mean squared error, R squared, and then the slope of the line between the predicted and the observed data. These metrics are basically a way of quantifying how much error there is in each model output. So first we compare our model output to the training data. We expect the training data values for MAE, mean absolute error, and RMSE to be low, indicating that the model is doing well and there isn't much error. And we expect the slope and the R squared values to be high or closer to 1, indicating good agreement between the model and the training data. That's because these are the data points that the model has already seen, so it should know what the patterns are and be able to replicate them. And then we give it the validation data. And these error metrics tell us how well the model is doing with data it has never seen before. So in this case, the training data is 60% of that whole georeference data set that we talked about, and the validation data is 40%. And these are randomly assigned, but stratified by location. So that means we're just making sure that the random assignment doesn't give the model, for example, only data in Florida, but then tell it to predict soil carbon in the Rocky Mountains, which might be very, very different. So based on these measures of variance, the random forest performs best. And we can see what that looks like. Here we have the actual measured observations on the x-axis versus the predicted outputs on the y-axis for training data on the left in blue and the validation data set on the right in orange. So the closer these blue and orange clusters of points are to being a straight line that matches the red one-to-one line, the better the model performance. So this is pretty decent given how huge of an area we're working with. The entire US is a lot bigger than most other study areas. And we have data from a lot of different sources, which definitely adds some complexity. So the fact that our R-squared value is 0.59 is actually quite exciting. Okay, a couple of things to discuss here. So based on the difference in error metrics between the training and the validation data sets, the machine learning models are overfitting the training data. The linear regression, on the other hand, has nearly identical error metrics describing the relationship between the input layers and the observations in both the training and the validation data sets, meaning that around 30% of the variation in SOC, just from the R-squared values, can be explained by a simple linear relationship between climate, topography, soil moisture, amount of vegetation, and soil organic carbon. And that makes sense since we know that these variables matter already. So for example, if we increase temperature due to climate change, maybe, we expect that to promote litter decomposition, but that will also be offset by the carbon dioxide fertilization effect expected with climate change. And topography has a similar impact, where soil organic carbon increases with elevation due to cooler temperatures and more water storage capacity. But biomass inputs and soil thickness decrease at higher elevations, actually leading to lower carbon sequestration. So the machine learning algorithms are trying to improve this understanding by quantifying some of the nonlinear relationships. And one way of doing this, for example, in the case of the KNN, is to memorize the training data. So the end result of applying that function is a very low R-squared value for the validation data set and an output map of soil carbon that is not particularly meaningful and does not reflect reality. However, the random forest is actually doing a reasonable job at predicting soil carbon in new locations, and it does improve upon the linear regression. So the output maps, which we'll see in a minute, are not perfect, but they do reflect the actual spatial patterns of SOC in the US in a meaningful enough way to derive useful climate and land use relationships from them. So the random forest model is a bit of a black box because we can't see the exact decision trees that were created, but we can see which predictor variables are the most important. So these are two different measures of importance, and we can see that location, latitude and longitude, is at the top for both. So location by itself should not be an important predictor in an ideal model. But what this is telling us is that there's some regional variation that we aren't capturing with the other variables, like precipitation or NDVI or soil moisture, that instead is implicitly captured by latitude and longitude. So that could be something like detailed farm management practices or crop type or some other factor related to location that we haven't thought of. So now we can start using these maps to dig into the SOC dynamics. So here's what an output map looks like. This is an average from 1990 to 2022, and the spatial pattern is very similar to other studies that have attempted to estimate total SOC across the US. You can see that my average estimate of 60.4 petagrams of carbon is also well within the range of other recent work. But What distinguishes my study is the really comprehensive data set that we talked about a minute ago, and that we have a map like this for every year of the study period. Also, the resolution is 30 meters, which is finer than most of these other studies. So while I don't expect big year-to-year variation with these annual maps, it is still valuable to have this data set so we can dig into some of the factors that impact SOC, like climate and land use change. So just to explain a little bit more why 30-meter spatial resolution and 1-year temporal resolution are important, I want to show this diagram. Spatial resolution is the area of land that is represented by one of these grid cells on a map. So higher resolution means higher quality images. It means that if we are looking at small scale processes, like at the farm level or the field level, we can use these SOC maps to see the difference, whereas if we have 1 kilometer resolution, there might be a farm and a suburban neighborhood in the same grid cell with the same value of soil carbon, which we know is not likely to match reality. And the reason we have 30-meter resolution is because that is the size of the Landsat NDVI pixels. And the same thing for temporal resolution. If we want to look at the impact of some sort of annual process like heat waves, it's a lot easier to see changes if you have maps for each year rather than a single 30-year average. On the other hand, we know that SOC does not change very quickly, so it probably isn't helpful to have monthly or daily maps because there wouldn't be any differences from one month to the next. So a bit of a side note here, just while we're talking about resolution, if you remember that table from maybe 2 slides back, we saw a wide range of estimates for the US from a low of 29 petagrams to a high of 106 petagrams of carbon for the same area for generally the same time period, although soil carbon changes slowly, so any differences in time frame are pretty unlikely to account for such drastically different estimates. Predictors of SOC vary by spatial scale, and so some of this large variation could be explained by the different resolutions of the studies, which range from 30 meters to 1 kilometers. But fundamentally, there's something else going on here. The modifiable area unit problem is this well-known issue in geographic research where different ways of aggregating the same values can produce pretty different results. And this comes up a lot in census studies where populations need to be split up. But here with soil carbon, we have an additional complication where all of those studies do not always use the same underlying data sets. So I don't have a solution to the modifiable area unit problem, but it is something to be aware of when we're harmonizing data sets and trying to compare with other research. Anyway, back to the results. While the national map and the average estimate are useful for an overview and comparison to recent studies, the regional estimates show more nuances. I know the text on the plot is a bit hard to read, but the colors actually do match the map if you want to look at a particular region. So we know that there are big regional differences in soil carbon across the US, and by comparison, the interannual differences are very small among regions with similar temperature and precipitation regimes. So that demonstrates that while climate does impact SOC, it is on a much longer time scale than annual or really even decadal. But we're going to talk more about climate in a minute. So SOC generally decreases with latitude, and the West and Rocky Mountains have particularly low values. In these regions, many of the soils are extremely soil moisture limited, which is a direct predictor of SOC content. The Fruitful Rim and the Prairie Gateway have actually been gaining SOC consistently since 1990, while every other region has remained closer to constant, potentially due to a combination of increased precipitation, some reforestation, and relatively stable temperatures. Intensive tillage has also historically been highest in the Fruitful Rim, the Mississippi Portal, and the Southern Seaboard, while the Prairie Gateway, Heartland, and Northern Great Plains have benefited from higher rates of reduced tillage and conservation tillage practices. So these Midwestern areas are also the only ones that have a more positive slope in the annual rate of SOC change, while the most negative changes in SOC accumulation are all found in the southern seaboard, eastern uplands, and northern crescent. Okay, we can also look at more granular changes over time. This figure is showing the slope of the trend line in SOC stocks on a per pixel basis. So for every 30-meter pixel, I've calculated the change from 1990 to 2022, and we can see that these long-term changes are only on the order of magnitude of 0.1 kilograms per meter squared per year. So from other research, we know that higher SOC levels are associated with colder, more stable climates and undisturbed natural areas with a lot of vegetation growth. With the world warming due to increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, there will be two effects. One, more plant growth due to higher carbon dioxide levels, leading to gains in soil carbon, but also more increased microbial activity due to the warmer temperature, leading to more soil carbon loss. So overall, soil organic carbon is likely to decline by around 10%, but there will probably be quite a bit of regional variation. So again, that's why it's really important to be tracking SOC and to be able to see some of these temperature and precipitation feedbacks so we can do our best to increase SOC in particularly at-risk areas with different agricultural practices. So we have a breakdown of land use categories here across the US. I calculated the mean total SOC value for each year for each land use class. And we can see that about a third of SOC is stored in shrubland and grassland soils, and another third is stored in agricultural soils. And then forested soils make up around a quarter of the total, and the rest is split between other categories. The estimate of SOC in croplands is 19.6 petagrams of carbon. So we know from prior research that the effects of land use change and land management are 7 to 10 times larger than the direct effects of climate change, excluding indirect effects such as wildfires. So that means a lot of the gain in SOC in the US over the last 100 years has been attributed to cropland expansion and nitrogen fertilizer use. But the next big research problem here is that there's no way to differentiate between land management practices in my maps without an additional data set to label lands. For example, the random forest model may know that a specific field has had a cover crop over the winter because the NDVI value remains higher than if it were bare soil. But it cannot say that the field has been managed with no-till versus traditional plowing before planting. So linking back to the overall goal of the FAA's research, that's where the life cycle assessment part comes in. Other researchers can now take these baseline maps and add in more information from farmers to try to understand which specific practices are sequestering carbon in the topsoil and how that influences and is influenced by biofuel agriculture. Okay, so this figure is showing the percentage of SOC in land areas that experience temperature and precipitation extremes of more than the 95th percentile of historical averages in a given year. Basically, this is showing that about half of the SOC in a given year is contained in soils that experience climate extremes. That means that annual temperatures and precipitation do not have a big influence on the interannual variation in SOC stocks across the US. That means that some extreme events like drought don't have as big an impact on SOC as we feared because of the short timescales involved. Drought reduces soil carbon content because of decreased plant litter input, but it also decreases carbon dioxide flux because of the slowing rate of decomposition. And these effects are regulated by land cover type, meaning that the impact of a single drought is really hard to see in the long-term SOC stocks, especially when we're averaging over the entire US. So that is a good thing for long-term carbon storage, since ideally carbon stored in the soil will not be quickly lost to the atmosphere every time the soil dries out. Okay, moving on now to wrap things up. So let's summarize. First of all, we now have this large georeference database of SOC measurements in the US that are associated with variables like climate, topography, soil moisture, and NDVI. And secondly, we have this thorough comparison of 7 machine learning models plus a linear regression. There's no one best method, so this is really valuable because now we can compare our work with other literature and have a better idea of the inner workings of these models and how they build nonlinear relationships with SOC. And then, of course, most importantly, we have a new map and a new estimate of SOC in the US. And hopefully these maps and analysis have the potential to be a resource for future studies on soil biogeochemistry and the role of anthropogenic disturbance and land use changes. It also helps us take a deeper look at some GIS concepts and questions like the modifiable unit area problem and the importance of considering spatial relationships. So that can help us develop plans for future research efforts where soil samples might be needed and try to make sure that we're thinking about distribution and variability. So this work is still ongoing. My small part is under review for publication in a journal, but the FAA has several related and interconnected projects planned out for the next few years. The next step is to incorporate this work into other studies and help inform siting and management for biofuel crops to push for more decarbonization in the aviation industry. And hopefully this work will also help us answer some of the big hanging questions about SOC, like the interactions between land use and carbon sequestration and future climate scenarios and how we model our understanding of carbon cycling. And just to go back to one of the very first slides that I showed, I want to end by emphasizing how tightly connected soil is to the overall climate and how important soil carbon is going to be in the coming years as we collectively try to mitigate climate change while growing enough food for the world. That's all I have for you right now. I'm happy to answer any questions or go back and talk about any of these slides in more detail.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Rubin, for an interesting, informative webinar. Now I'd like to open the floor for questions, starting first with some of the questions received through the Q&A, and I'm not sure we have any of those currently. I'll just double check here. We had one comment about classic coordinate problems, which I think anybody who's done GIS is well aware of, but no questions so far. Does anyone online have a question? Hopefully we'll unmute your mic in a second. I'm sure Sebastian's working on that. Or if you're thinking of one, just go ahead and type it into the QA while we work on getting your mics unmuted.
Anna.
Oh,
Fabrizio here. Thanks for sharing, really interesting. Have you start thinking on possible like protocol or standard protocol to tackle the modifiable area unit problem, which it's a well-known issue? Because I found quite interesting that part, and probably we should be all looking to that issue more closely.
Yeah, thank you for the question. You know, I wish I had a solution. I mean, this is a problem that affects every aspect of geographic research, and it would take another dissertation to solve. But I do think that there's a lot of value in documenting processes and being really clear about where our data sets are coming from and what resolution they're at and how we're combining them, just so that we can be sure that we're actually comparing apples to apples when we're talking about other people's research and we're not comparing two entirely different methods that we wouldn't expect to correspond in that way.
Sure, thanks.
any other questions? Make sure you unmute your own mic if you're trying to ask one.
I put a question in the Q&A, but I'm happy to ask it live if that's a bit more
Perfect.
interactive.
Sure.
Hi, Hannah. Love the talk. Thought it was great. So I was looking at. Do you have any indication of your that when you look at your organic carbon maps, when they vary, is your organic carbon varying gently enough that you believe that you've captured all the small details like local minima, local maxima, all this kind of stuff from your sampling? Because I think you said you had about 30,000 samples across the US, and so there must be kilometers between which don't have samples, and how does it vary in between those kilometers, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, uh, yes and no. Um, we are limited by our pixel size, which is 30 meters, which we would hope would be small enough to capture a lot of that variation. But again, it's a model. So anything without a measurement, we just don't have any way of ground truthing. And we really need more measurements to fill those spaces in. The 30,000 observations, it sounds like a lot, but when you think about how big the US is, it really does not cover every location, especially because we have different densities of sampling in some areas that are historically very well researched and some areas that are not. And that those measurements are also covering a 30-year time period. So when you think about it that way, we really have pretty sparse samples, and that is why we need machine learning to try to fill in the gaps. But yeah, I absolutely think the more ground truth data we have, the better. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I was thinking, I was very empathetic about your sparse data set for spatial stuff, particularly when it goes over time, has very similar problems. I was trying to think that because, with like the neural net techniques, you're obviously like putting in your spatial coordinates in the and organic carbon you have. Are there any other maps of soil properties that are available, particularly at similar resolution, which you have more certainty at, which maybe correlate with organic carbon, which could maybe give a little bit more direction to the machine learning techniques in their output?
Yeah, there are other maps. Unfortunately, well, they're actually based on the same underlying data sets, so it's not
Right.
particularly helpful. It's not a new source of data. It's maybe measuring a different parameter, but it is the same observation. So it unfortunately can't help us fill in those blanks.
Yeah, and probably at the same site as well. Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, exactly. It's definitely a challenge.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
All right, we have another question from the Q&A. Can these methods be used to estimate regional agricultural nutrient surplus?
That's a good question. I would think so. It's just that you need more data. You have to think about what variables you're trying to measure and where you have observations. So if you have observations of nutrient surplus and you can add them in, then yeah, I think machine learning can really benefit a lot of different studies that focus on related interconnected variables. But if you don't have any underlying observations to train your model, then it's more of a guess than anything.
Okay. Are there any other questions before we wrap things up?
Got another really simple one, which is
Yeah.
when you publish, will you also publish the data set and the scripts? Because we'd love to try this in Europe.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
All right. So I think we'll wrap things up there. Thank you again for your interest in the webinar series and to Dr. Rubin for an interesting talk. A reminder, we will send out a very short survey. It's very short, so please try and fill that out if you have any recommended future topics and anything to help us improve the webinar experience. Please stay tuned for more information on upcoming webinars, our LinkedIn pages, and various other social media pages that we have. And we'll be posting those announcements as they come up. And other than that, have a great day. Thank you very much.